ways we lost our moral voice by not standing up to these forces and to recognizing or accepting that Christian heretics exist, which is what these people are. They're heretical. Of course it's an uncomfortable and unpleasant fight. And yet it's one that could have made such a difference within the landscape. You say the word Christian in the wider society, and who do we think of? Charlatans and demagogues who use the Christian religion to amass vast sums of personal wealth. Pat Robertson is personally worth anywhere between $500,000 and $1 billion. And what did we do? We didn't fight back. You go to these anti-war demonstrations, which we hold in Washington, and I look around and where are the clergy? Where are they? My father dragged me off to one anti-war demonstration after another, and there were many clergy. I think that the struggles within the mainstream church, demographically, in terms of falling numbers, in terms of has actually perpetuated, I think, the cowardice that created the problem in the first place. And with all of my frustrations with the church, I come out of the church, formed by the church. And that great religious left, King, Dorothy Day, Berrigan, I mean, that's who I hold fast to. And I think that a society in crisis so desperately needs those voices. And then they're not being heard. So in very specifics, I think that it's incumbent upon people with a religious conscience that their faith propels them to carry out acts of civil disobedience, because we are the last thin line of defense. The rage that is being expressed by our disenfranchised working class, the kind of permanent underclass that we have allowed corporations to create in this country. 40 million Americans in poverty, tens of millions of Americans in a category called near poverty. 1 million people last year had personal bankruptcies because they couldn't pay their medical bills, along with 45,000 people who died. I mean, this is just obscene. And I think if we, who care about issues of equality and egalitarianism, don't begin to express this rage, it will be left to these very frightening proto-fascist movements like the Tea Party and others. And the rage is legitimate. And not just the rage at the power elite, but the rage towards the liberal class is legitimate. Because we continue to support political structures like the Democratic Party, who since 1994, with the passage of NAFTA, has thrust a knife into the back of the working men and women of this country. And my own family comes out of it. I've watched what's happened to them. Clinton was the most egregious of that, speaking in that kind of feel your pain language, while he gutted welfare, deregulated the banks, deregulated the FCC, which has allowed Fox and Clear Channel and these other corporate interests to buy up the airwaves. So I think the church has a vital role to play. And I think its voice is incredibly important, but we're not hearing it. And if we don't hear it, then this irrational movement that celebrates violence, speaks in the language of violence, celebrates the gun culture, perpetuates naked bigotry towards Muslims and homosexuals and undocumented workers and liberals. And I watched the breakdown of Yugoslavia. War in Yugoslavia was caused by the economic collapse of Yugoslavia. And once the currency crisis took hold, all traditional systems of power were discredited, and we vomit up figures like Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic. And we're no more immune to that than Weimar Germany was immune to it, or the breakdown of Tsarist Russia. I mean, history is replete with examples of what happens. It was an obsession, by the way, of Dostoevsky's. His novel Demons is about it. Notes from Underground is about it. It's about the collapse of liberalism. And liberal institutions are important because they provide mechanisms within the formal structures of power by which injustices and grievances can be redressed. It functions as a kind of safety valve. That's how we got the New Deal. That's how we got this 1964 Civil Rights Voting Act. But now, because that system doesn't function, because 6 million Americans or families are thrown out of their homes, because of bank repossessions and foreclosures by corporations like Citibank, which are criminal enterprises, that rage is going to be galvanized by terrifying, we've already seen it, lunatic fringe elements within our political culture. And so the importance of those of us who consider ourselves grounded in a different type of morality to not only physically speak out but begin to carry out acts of civil disobedience becomes vitally important, because otherwise we cede the ground to, I think, very, very terrifying figures.
So let's just start here, and then Kalani next after that.
Welcome to Dallas-Fort Worth, the arsenal of our empire. And I was thinking, as you went through your experiences, that Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth and Bell Helicopter in Hearst and Raytheon and McKinney and Garland with General Dynamics, that you have been subject of our products produced here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I apologize for that. But the question is, how can we get the Congress and these conservative Republicans that proliferate in Texas to begin to address our defense budget? We did $23 billion in the Dallas-Fort Worth region in 2009. It's our biggest industry, and it hides in plain sight. How do we make people aware that this economy, our regional economy, is dependent on making weapons?
Well, that's what the defense or the war industry has been quite clever at doing. It's spreading this out, not only in Dallas, but throughout the country. So almost every, or large numbers of Congress people defend the defense industry under the rubric of creating jobs, including Pelosi. I mean, it really crosses party lines. The fact is, the empire's dying. We are borrowing $2 billion a day from the Chinese. We have run up the largest deficits in human history, $12.8 trillion, which, as Andrew Basovich points out, we can never repay. Once we try to service that debt, we'll have to sell $96 billion a week to the Chinese. It's not a sustainable system. We are both borrowing to maintain a level of consumption in an empire we can no longer afford. So either we begin to confront the reality that faces us, or we barrel, which it appears we're doing, towards implosion. As Berrigan said when I spoke to him, he said, the tragedy is not that the American empire is dying, all empires die. The tragedy is that we're bringing so many people down with us. And I think that voices like Wendell Berry's become important, because we have to begin to live with a new ethic. It's not accidental that the economic crisis is intimately twinned with the environmental crisis, because we have allowed corporations, unfettered and unregulated corporations, to turn everything into a commodity, including the natural world, that you exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And it's very hard to argue with jobs. I've been working in southern West Virginia on my new book, and to get up into 5 big coal in McDowell County or Welch is to court physical violence, because those are the only jobs that are there. And in a collapsing economy, it's increasingly only those jobs that are, you have now 1 in 6 American workers unemployed or underemployed, with huge numbers of workers trying to make a living in places like Walmart, where the average worker works 28 hours a week, although their wages put them below the poverty line. So as you create this neo-feudalist society, the struggle or the competition for the scraps becomes fiercer and fiercer. And it makes the problem that you raised harder and harder to address, which is precisely the way they want it. And it's why they're going after public sector unions right now. The last bastion of protection for workers. The demonization of teachers is terrifying. The closing of public libraries, the assault on public education is just rendering us deaf, dumb, and blind. So I think that within the formal mechanisms of power, there is no way to address this issue. I mean, it used to be that 20 years ago, democratic figures like Proxmire and other would raise issues about specific weapon systems. Now you don't hear it anymore at all. They get everything they want. And we spend $1 trillion a year in defense-related spending. The next largest expenditure is the Chinese at 25 billion. It's absurd, and it's, as Seymour Melliman at Columbia and others have written, what it's doing is hollowing the country out from the inside. So I think within the established power structure, there's no way left to argue about it, and that it's in many ways we almost have to start all over again. I mean, the destruction of radical movements like the old socialist and wobblies and anarchists and communists that had kept the liberal class honest, they're all gone, and the liberal class has been disemboweled. So we approach a moment of crisis with very, very, unfortunately, very few tools by which we can fight back, which shouldn't stop us from fighting back. But I think we have to make a very realistic appraisal of how meager our resources have become. And look at the press. And the press has just been corporatized. There are roughly 6 corporations that control almost everything most Americans listen to, read, or hear. Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney. It's all, as Neil Postman understood, we're amusing ourselves to death. We're preoccupied with who is it, Charlie Sheen, or I mean, it's crazy. And huge segments of American society are rendered virtually invisible. We never see them.
I saw you here, and I think with kind of the rate that we're at to finish up here by 8:30 and to go there, maybe we'll take questions that we've currently got here. Thank you.
Hey, Chris. Kalani Kachela. I heard you on the radio on Humankind, which prompted me to read your book, Empire of Illusion. And I'm really behind what you do. I served in Iraq last year for 6 months as a chaplain, and I'm wondering if you have, I'm sure you do have an opinion on whether we'll get out as Obama has said we will, and also what advice might you give to the President and the Congress concerning Libya?
Well, we're not going to get out of Iraq. That's pretty clear. I mean, and if you've been to Iraq, the infrastructure facilities, especially with the 3 large super bases, which are just 3 large American cities, have been built to stay. Libya is tough because I've interviewed Gaddafi twice. I've spent a lot of time in Libya. And when you interview these figures, it's not so much what they say, which is pretty predictable, but the interesting thing as a reporter is you get a sense of them as a person. And Gaddafi's a killer. There was no question in my mind that if he had retaken Benghazi, he would have killed the way Hafez al-Assad did in Hama.